Thanks so much. Oh, there we go. So now let me share my screen. There we go. So this is me. This is Natalia Carfi. I'm the executive director of the Open Data Charter, and I just wanted to quickly introduce the organization that I lead. The Open Data Charter is a global civil society organization that was launched in 2015. We are a collaboration of over 150 governments and experts working on open data based on a shared set of principles. So we are kind of a special organization because we are both an actual charter with these 6 principles that you're seeing right now, and then an organization that helps promote these principles. Those 6 principles were created out of a global conversation that took place for 2 years. We had in-person meetings and workshops. We had Twitter conversations. We had online service. Deep dive interviews with governmental representatives, multilateral representatives, civil society organizations from all around the world. We did a global survey in 3 languages. And after all of that process, these 6 principles of open data were created. These principles are said to be used and promoted by governments all around the world in every level of government. And these same principles were revised and reviewed in 2019. And actually, the Open Data Charter community decided that the principles were still sound. So these are the 6 principles that we're still working with around the Open Data Charter. But we know that the agenda of open data has evolved, has move past the moment of publish and they will come. So governments were starting to create their open data portals and just publish whatever data they could get a hold of, and then expect that journalists, civil society organizations, and citizens would come and reuse that data without any purpose. And we've shifted from that moment to a moment where we are working with a publish with a purpose idea, first trying to understand the civic problem that we're trying to solve, and then evolve into a publication of governmental data in open formats. But now that we are working on that, we're also seeing an evolution of the open data agenda. From the Open Data Charter, what we've seen, and these are just a couple of bullet points of what we have seen, but we have all the speakers here to share their views. We've seen the open data community and the open data agenda moving towards thematic agendas, so more specialized kind of communities created around a certain theme of data: climate change, gender data, public procurement data, which makes the work around open data more specialized, more up to point, but also has the challenge of creating siloed open data communities that are not collaborating among themselves. The other challenge that we are seeing in the open data world that has to do with data more than just open data is regulation. There's a lot of governments in different areas of the globe, in different levels of governments, that are actually trying to create regulation that actually balances the right to access information and open data underneath that umbrella, and the right for privacy, for private information not to be published. And so striking the right balance in between those two rights seems to be a challenging task for governments. Aside from that, there is also a movement towards regulating what private sector can do with personal data that will also and is actually affecting in positive and negative ways the access to data in reusable formats. So within that, all of those challenges and work that we're seeing around open data and around data as a whole, is that we actually created this session and invited everybody at Atmosfest to discuss. But let me stop sharing my my screen and just get back to the speakers to understand what they are seeing in the open data world and the broader data community as where this agenda is actually moving forward. Let me introduce Arturo Muente from the Inter-American Development Bank, who will share a perspective on where this agenda is going in the Americas and especially in LATAM region. And thank you very much for joining, Arturo.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, of course, for the organizers that are putting together the event. You're right. I mean, we've been, at least I've been working with the open data activities in the region for the last, say, 10 years. And I think that there's an evolution on the conversation. There's a maturity that some countries have reached. And if they haven't reached it, the actual data ecosystem is evolving in a way that is demanding this conversation getting more complex. I also had a couple of slides, and hopefully they will make my presentation easy. So if you're seeing the slides, yes?
Perfect.
So yeah, the first thing, I think you mentioned it already, is that open data starts with the publication of data. And it talks a lot about not only the purpose that you were mentioning, and I think, and we agree, of course, with that, but also the last two principles in the list of 6 principles. No, it's open data for improved governance, citizen engagement, for innovation, for inclusive development. So data, I think the challenge has been that the value of data is realized when we use that data. But publishing it, especially from the public sector, has been so hard. And it's been so much barriers that we found, and so much, the journey was, I think, more complex than what we expected when we were first drawing these principles, that in many cases, once the data is published, we said, okay, let's go, let's see what's next. And it's really just the beginning when you publish the data. You have to help the communities realize that data. You have to build the ecosystems. You have to even help understand the value of that data you're opening and the potential activities that could be done once that data is increased. So that's the one thing I wanted to start with. The other one is, and hopefully I'll stay a little bit with the next one, but this one is just the snapshot that we got on the 2020 application of the Open Data Barometer. I'm not using the Global Data Barometer because I expect Silvana to talk a lot about that. I think that's a great effort that actually reflects this sort of more comprehensive approach to data. I have a slide that I think you've seen before on that. But basically, it's nothing new here, but we have a very dispersed status on open data in the region. I don't think it has changed that much. If any, it probably has compressed a little around the middle. But there are countries where we're still sort of starting the conversation about open data. They have heard about it. They have a very, basic idea of what it is. But by far, we're not done with just even realizing and creating awareness about open data. So the other thing I wanted to say is that I see some sort of open data fatigue, among policymakers, even among donors. And I get it. There are countries that have, they grab the concept of open data and they run, and they're very advanced and they're very sort of sophisticated, and they are realizing all the benefits and all the value that come out of that data. But there are some countries in our regions that are still just beginning to untap and understand the potential of open data. So if anything, this is a call for just, doing the good job you're doing on the charter and to continue this conversation on our open data. Now, having said that, the conversation is gotten more complex, right? And the best analogy that I used is this map that probably you've seen before. And there's a story that comes with this map. And the story is very simple. You start with different groups, of interests around data in this fictitious land of data. And you have, access to information, and then open data, which again, is not necessarily the same. You have the data security people, cybersecurity. You have the data sharing, interoperability, data collaboratives, tech enthusiasts, of course, on data and artificial intelligence, distributed networks. You have data protection, of course, you mentioned them, and national statistics, like, up on the corner, right? And then these conversations evolved, and the massive amount of data that has been created, and the massive digital footprint that we're leaving every second is making each of these sort of groups more complex and more diverse and bigger. And they're starting to, step on each other's toes, and what seemed to be a lot of space between these conversations are becoming, overstepping and overlaps and areas of uncertainty. And that's where we think we are. We have a fragmented agenda. We have been promoting these different sort of conversations. All of them are valuable. All of them have, a reason to be. And we think that all of them need to be here. It's just that in our efforts, I think that in our efforts to cross-cut the traditional vertical silos that we have in our countries, we have been creating these horizontal silos around data. Conversations that are happening isolated from each other, and that once they discover that the other exists, or that they realize that the other may have something to do with what I'm doing, we're not prepared to coordinate as we should. So how are countries dealing with that? And this is just as open data starts with a publication, we believe that data protection is an enabler of the data economy, because it provides you with some basic rights with which, especially in some countries that have a more evolved ecosystem on data, it gives them some protections and some guidelines through which they can feel more comfortable sharing their data. So it's not necessarily enemies, one from the other. They're just two sides of the same coin, and they need to be coordinated. So one of the things that we've seen countries doing are these data strategies. Of course, Europe as a region and European countries, some of them in particular, are leading the pack here. But countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand have data strategies. And I'm not gonna go through the slide, but basically what we've seen is three different pillars that are common. They're not exclusive, but they're common to the ones we've seen. Governance, which speaks a lot to what you were saying in terms of rules of engagements, regulations, how to deal with this fragmented data ecosystem. Talent, and here I always say not only data scientists, which of course there's a huge gap in data science, but also in policymakers that understand the value of data science and understand the value of making decisions based on data, on the value of having those data scientists in government, at least from our point of view. And then use, if the countries that I've mentioned that are relatively more advanced, still in their strategies are pushing for a more or more use of data in our countries, we need to include that as a must. And with this, I close at least the slides, and I'm more than happy to receive any questions regarding this. But they are also things that are worth mentioning. All these strategies have concrete action plans. It's not a pie in the sky. It's not just a strategic kind of, God knows how we're going to put that in practice. They have concrete action plans. They have a governance structure. They have an ecosystem approach. Some of them have been very sort of a very good outreach to receive feedback on that strategy, walking the talk in the co-creation of it, of sorts, monitoring and evaluation indicators. You cannot measure, you cannot manage what you can't measure. And paradoxically, there's not a lot of data about data. So they're starting to build that. And then they all mention it's an iterative process. I would say, we have practices. Some appear to be good, but it's too early still to call anyone best. So they understand, I think, this, and all of the countries that we've seen have this iterative process. So that's it for me. I'm more than happy to answer any question or comment. I hope I didn't take more than the time allotted. Thank you.
Thank you, Arturo. No, you didn't. It was right on point. And once again, Please share your questions or ideas via chat. And then after all the presentations, you will also be able to unmute and maybe ask a question live. Muchiri, are you there? I will be passing on the torch to you. Thank you very much for joining, Muchiri. Let me do a quick intro and then leave the floor to you. So Muchiri is the Executive Director of the Local Development Research Institute, but also the lead at the African Open Data Network. So Muchiri will be sharing with us thoughts and ideas from the African region around this evolution of the open data agenda and the data agenda in general. Muchiri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nati. Always delighted to be among friends, familiar faces, new friends, new allies. Delighted that we continue to champion this conversation. So I'm joining in from Nairobi, Kenya on this 20th of March when we've had protests, coincidentally, I believe, in I think at least 4 African countries, especially notable ones in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And I think for every one of those, you're going to find that open data would have been a concrete solution to some of the tensions that have bubbled up to the surface. In South Africa, it has to do with energy costs, the load shedding, where they have these rolling blackouts to try and manage supply versus demand. Having a really big effect on businesses and quality of life. And it's understandable that people would get very upset. But then there's very little data, very little information about the real drivers, how the energy sector works, there's an open data issue there. Transparency and accountability issue, to be more specific. In Kenya, this has a long tail back to the elections and the real feelings by the opposition that there was an election that was rigged, right? So you have this issue around access to data, in this case elections data, and we continue seeing signals of areas where people want more information, want more data, and they're not getting that data. In Nigeria, another elections problem there. So you see this challenge of a lack of access to data around the things that matter most to people living in those countries is I believe a signal and a sign that we are still really, really far away from where we thought we would be 10 years ago, when we started really pushing hard on the idea of open data. So I think just to give you an idea before I talk about what I think the future looks like, maybe it would be good to talk about the past and just to try and understand a little bit, how we've gotten to where we are. So I think for Africa, the iteration of open data that we see the most, that is most visible, is linked to a lot of the programming, the funding that came from development partners about between 2010, 2012, and mostly the World Bank at the time. And a lot of that money that came into our countries was lines of credit. So this was not, most of it, I believe, was not grant money. So Ethiopia, Rwanda, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Kenya, a lot of that money, Burkina Faso, it was open data initiatives that were funded by development partners, in this case, the World Bank, but this was debt. So our children are going to pay for that money at some point, if we're not already doing a whole lot of that repayment. We, I think, took a very simplistic view and a bit naive view of open data at the time. And I know we're very excited about the prospects and we're very excited about what could happen. And we had signals from governments that looked like they were happy to open up their data. So we really ran off with this, and it was an exciting time. But the problem was we left out some really important things One is, I think we didn't have a proper understanding of what the political economy of data looked like. So there was no policy, regulatory environment around this. We really didn't understand what that could look like. But we had this ambition that open data would sit in a centralized architecture, and every part of government would be, publishing to this data portal. We took our guidance from data.gov, data.gov.uk, data.world bank, right? Centralized vehicles for carrying all this data into the public space. Yeah, but I think those of you who work in government or have worked in government know that is easier said than done, right? There are territories, there are owners, there are people who feel that this is my corner and you cannot step on it. And Arturo mentioned something about those silos. You have those vertical silos, and then at some point we try to make this cross-cutting effort to try and reduce those silos, and we create new ones, and these are horizontal ones. And now you have cells, right? You have this little box that's completely isolated of people who are trying to do something around data and not coordinating or talking to everyone else. And I'd say, just going back to the Global Data Barometer, which of course we're looking forward to hearing Silvana talk more about it, and the Open Data Inventory by Open Data Watch. You have this progress but no progress kind of story, that countries have made some progress, but then at the same time there has been regression, and a lot of that I think is because of the foundations that we set for open data. And I think that's where I'm beginning to see what our future could look like. Just to give a quick view, we had no, like I mentioned, there's no policy. There was really a little effort that had gone into understanding what the political economy could look like, how to address those intergovernmental and intragovernmental issues that require data to move from one department to a centralized portal. We had almost, in some countries, almost zero domestic resources going into open data. The vast majority of the funding in the countries I mentioned, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, Rwanda, Ethiopia, a lot of that money came from almost entirely from development partners. So that goes back to that issue of ownership, etc. And so just to give you an idea then what I think the future could look like. One, I think we do need to get a stronger sense of ownership when it comes to open data in Africa, and especially open data in the context of development. One, I think we're seeing a lot more demand to get data to address and make decisions around the development frameworks that are currently being implemented. So about the SDGs being a big driver, the regional economic blocks we have, and the regional economic communities, we have these plans that we're developing. Open data is a really big part of helping address the issue of information intelligence for decision making. And I think that's a big driver that will continue to be. We do need to push for domestic resources for open data. If our governments are not putting their own money, if we're not putting our own money on open data, I don't think we have a chance of having it more sustainable. And I think the other thing has to do with walking away from something we held very dearly. And I think from a personal perspective, held very dearly. And this is that idea of this single portal where everyone comes and finds all the data they need for everything. And I'd like to say, look, the future of open data, I think in terms of that implementation, might be federated. I think at a national government level, let's have governments push for standardization, data standards, technology standards compliant platforms. And then let the ministries and the departments run away with this and make open data work for them based on the context and the agenda that they're pushing. And I think those are some of the things that we need to start thinking about. Make this work let this work the best way it can for the communities that are trying to achieve something. And I think that's the direction that I'd advocate for, and the direction that I'm seeing signals for at the moment. So unless you want me to talk for another 10 minutes, I think I'll stop there, Nati, and spare you my pontification. Thank you.
Thank you, Muchiri. And I would listen for 10 more minutes, definitely. It's super interesting to hear your perspective. Thank you so much. But we will pass on the mic to Silvana. And then we do have some questions, so everybody will be back on the mic. But let's now pass the floor to Silvana Fumega. She is leading the Global Data Barometer. That has been actually signaled by both our speakers because it has its first publication last year, and it made a massive impact on the data community around the globe. So Silvana, the floor is yours to share what you've seen from the results of the Global Data Barometer.
Thank you, Nati. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with friends and colleagues that I know for quite a long time. The problem is coming last is always difficult. I'm not sure I'm gonna say anything new or different, or I mean, on a way, it's good because I guess we share a similar idea about what's going on from different approaches, from different sectors. We are all coming from different places, but I think we are all understanding that something has to happen or something is going on in terms of the open data field. So first of all, I mean, we, in this sense, we were talking, or the first initial question was about beyond data openness. And the idea is to think and talk about how the agenda is doing these days. So I'd like to start by saying that a little over 10 years, as everybody was saying, many of us started to be part of a group of people talking about openness and government data. And as, again, was mentioned before, we were hearing that everything should be open and people will come and use it, and in a way, value, social or individual, will be generated. 10 years later, we know that the agenda is way more complex than open and they will come. So nowadays we are talking and thinking about different issues related to the open data field. In a sense, we are talking about privacy and care of data, protection of human rights in the development of technological interventions, development of techniques and tools for machine learning, digital security, data governance structures, and inclusion in the production of data and algorithms, to name a few. And all these topics can no longer be ignored. So these issues have complicated the initial open government data agenda, whose principal and almost exclusive concern was to increase the accessibility of public data. So now we know that we should ask ourselves much more complex questions, and we are getting increasingly aware of the complexities of data ecosystems, and also about the groups and problems that we are living outside of our data. And I think we cannot do that anymore. So in a way, our work is increasingly interconnected with many areas and many groups. I mean, the silos that was mentioned before. And we are thinking and interacting with other people that we were not probably a decade ago. But this complexity is making our work much more meaningful, I think. And also this complexity asks for new ways of assessing and measuring our work and the status of the agenda. And that's where the Global Data Barometer that was mentioned before, and thank you all for mentioning that, that's where the GDB started to be developed. After almost a decade of the launch of the Open Data Barometer, that's the previous measurement that we had. And in 2022, as Nati was mentioning, the GDB launched its first edition. And because of this complexity that I mentioned before, and it was mentioned in all the conversations, we knew we need new benchmarks and new ways of collecting and learning about the data. I'm going to share just a few numbers about this edition. Let me see. Okay, here. Does it look okay? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So the idea is was to provide a new benchmark and the key data needed to better understand the state of data for public good around the globe. And in a sense, it was, I mean, there was a question in the chat there about the SDG. And in a way, we use the SDG to define, or at least to have an idea about what public good could be. I mean, when we are talking about data for public good, we can go later into that, but I remember that because it was mentioned in the chat. So it draws on primary data from a global expert survey, and it was carried during 2021 in 109 countries. I'm not going to go into much of the results. I mean, the details of the results, you can go into our website and check the country or the region that you are interested. But what I want to say, I mean, apart from the numbers that you see there, a little bit about the hubs, the data set, the frameworks, and the open data initiatives, is that what we were trying to do is to provide a brief overview of the critical knowledge gaps on how data policy and practice are unfolding in different sectors, regions, and countries. And in a way, as the name of this session, we were trying to go beyond open data, and we did that through a series of thematic lenses, as Nati was mentioning in the beginning. We are looking at the data not only in a general way about the governance of the data, but also looking at the studies of the data through thematic lenses like land, political integrity, climate action, health and COVID, public contracting, company information, and public finances. So that's basically an idea about the structure. I mean, you can see there some of the core modules about governance and capabilities and the thematic ones that I just mentioned, but I don't want to go into all the details. I mean, what I can say is all the thematic modules were developed in partnership with expert organizations like Open Government Partnership, Transparency International, Open Contracting, Open Ownership, Global Initiative for Fiscal Transparency, and Land Portal. So in a way, there's a lot of knowledge that was gathered to develop these indicators and to gather the data. And in a way, Muchiri was in charge, or his organization was in charge of the Africa Regional Hub to gather all that data. So there were many organizations involved. But what I want to say is to share a few brief observations coming from the collection of that data in a general sense, so we can later discuss and talk about the questions that are in the chat. So basically, one of the first things that I could say, thinking about the open government data agenda, and I'm very particular about the government data agenda because in a way we are talking about the data that is coming from each of the governments and is reflected in this measurement or in other type of discussions. But we can say that it's still a key component of these measurements, even though we were trying to go beyond open data. The problem is, or the thing is, that open data agendas are alive, but no longer progressing in a near way. I mean, in a way, they are not increasing at the same rate that they were increasing a few years ago, let's say 2016, 2015, when we were at the peak of this agenda. So the good news is that developing and using data for the public good is possible. What we did is to try to match a country with all the best scores that were attained today. I mean, different countries were attaining different scores. What we did was to gather all the best ones, and we created an imaginary country, and the data or the score that it was given to us, it was 95 out of 100. So even today, I mean, that ideal is attainable. The problem is we need to work in different countries and different regions because no country, no real country is scoring those kind of numbers. So in a way, one of the main things that we need to work on is capacity gaps, skill, training, infrastructure. It remains a significant barrier to delivering value from data. In some cases, we know that the digital divide may be narrowing, but still gaps exist across government, private sector, and civil society in their ability to create and use data for the public good. Another key takeaway, as it was mentioned before about regulations, is that well-drafted frameworks deliver better data. When rules are explicit about data collection, management, and sharing, data is much more likely to be available, useful, and sustainable in addressing any number of issues for the public good. And also something that I want to address, and I think that's key for all of us here, is that collaboration between traditional civil society, civic technologies, or between journalists and private sector applications providers. They are driving new uses of data that highlight, let's say, corruption, promote public integrity, monitor environmental issues, or shape public policy debates. So collaboration, in a way, is key within civil society, with private sector, and also with governments. And something that is also relevant, and it's very clear when we saw the data, is that there's a clear evidence that partnership, and the work of international organizations in terms of advocacy of certain topics and certain themes is showing results in terms of advancing the data agenda. And in a way, the work of, let's say, open contracting partnership, or the work of the Global Fiscal Transparency Initiative, I mean, we see how that type of data is getting better and better every year. So in a way, there's an impact about the work that these organizations are doing in different topics around the world. So just to finish, a few final ideas and looking a little bit towards the future. What I can say is that if we want to release the potential value of data for the public good, we must work together in different topics, as for example, increase the transparency of government data use by making the public more aware of when governments are collecting, sharing, and using data. In a way, this can promote more accountable data practices and support greater collaboration across sectors in using data efficiently, because one of the main things is to get value from using, as it was mentioned before, publishing the data is only the first step. I mean, we need to use that data, we need to get value out of those uses as well. Also, support cross-sector partnership for data use, develop robust data sharing frameworks, including the subnational level, is important, so that the potential abuses are limited and the positive reuse of data is enabled. And also, one of the last things that I want to mention is the emphasis on equity and inclusion, recognizing that data governance, capability, availability, and use all need to explicitly consider the needs of marginalized population. I mean, we should all be considering the data. We should be all including the data, because whatever is not including the data is not seen, is not counting. So we are not thinking about solutions or policies or tools for those populations or those problems. So I'm going to stop there because I'm not sure how many minutes I've been talking. I'm only just inviting everybody to check the website. There you can see the results that they were mentioned in different regions, Latin America, Africa, and other regions, and all the thematic points. And I'm happy to discuss more details and more questions that are coming from the chat. So once again, thank you for this opportunity and this conversation.
Thank you, Sil, for your presentation. And we already have the link in the chat. So anybody that wants to click on that, you'll see the Global Data Barometer in its full force. We do have a couple of questions. And the first one that arrived for everybody is, what arguments resonate the best when talking with governments in investing in open data efforts? So who wants to take the lead on that question? I do have some ideas, but okay, I'll give it a go. But I know that everybody has something to say about this. In my previous life, I used to be a public official leading open data policies. So I've been in government working on this. And there's a couple of different things that, of course, context matters. First of all, there is the right to access information. So citizens have the right to actually access information. And open data is a way of making, of working and making that right actually be implemented. And I'm going back to the explanation of proactive transparency and active transparency and non-active transparency. Open data is a way to proactively publish governmental data and actually letting citizens access that information without being requested first. So that's one of the kind of the arguments. Then there's also another argument that resonates with governments, which has to do with something that Arturo talked a bit about. It's also the innovation aspect of open data. While publishing governmental open data, we are also helping the innovation and even the economic innovation area to grow in a certain country, because we've seen multiple new businesses being created around the open data that is being published, and there's a couple of research already done on how these new businesses came into place because of the open data, making open data its core business, or just helping out with creating innovative solutions for businesses. There's also the discussion of cultural change within government. So open data has to do with digitalization within government, but it also has to do with cultural change. So we also see open data as part of a much broader discussion of open government. So the way that government actually works and how it relates with citizens, and being open data one of those changes that need to happen in order to open up the government. And as every cultural change, that's where the speed is not a factor, because cultural changes take time, and governments were not designed at the beginning when they were designed to be open or to open up the data. So that's where I back what Arturo said about not only working and trying to create and bringing the skills of data literacy within government and kind of technicians that can actually publish and use that data, but also bringing in the political scientists that actually designed and the policies to this conversation, because, as I said, this is also a cultural change. And I'm going to leave it there. Any comments from any of the speakers? I know everybody has ideas around this.
I would just add, and I'm sorry, Muchiri, I jumped at the mic. So I would just add that the transparency link, I think, will put your foot on the door, but also, and it's sort of the inverse of what Muchiri was saying. No, I mean, if they see this as too complex, as too complicated, that it will take, one administration to show results, then that disencourages them. So, low-hanging fruits, impact, in short-term impact. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be aiming at the long-term reforms and implementation, but if it basically gains traction if you can show sort of short-term results, some impacts, and low-hanging fruits that are out there. I would just add that.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I agree absolutely with Arturo, because the government of the day won that election, or as some of my friends in Africa say, selection, based on political promises, right? And the politicians need to show results. They need to show delivery, based on the political promises they made. And I think having that concurrent, that idea of concurrency, that, you're going to be doing something that's in the long term, it's going to benefit, it's going to deliver X, Y, Z, but in the short term, this is going to help you deliver, on this particular promise. And I think those kind of, that kind of sale where you're making a case for open data based on the contribution it will make to the political administration's ability to deliver on its promises, does have the potential to move things faster along, especially when you're looking at high-level political commitment for open data. And I think that's potentially pretty useful when you're also trying to get domestic resources mobilized to get some of that work done. That's one area where I've seen, for instance, with Kenya, with beneficial ownership, the government went all the way on beneficial ownership, from policy to infrastructure to regulation to full rollout. And as far as I know, a whole lot of that was done with domestic resources. And the first phase of it was not open. So I can't just log in and check who the beneficial owner of a specific organization is at the moment. But the next phase is going to be, more open. Right now, there's some language there that, talks about you have to be a competent authority in order to access the beneficial ownership register. But you understand, these are very progressive bits of regulation, of policy around openness that have made their way into some of our very nascent democracies in the larger scheme of things, pretty fast. So that's my thought. Align that with the political side. But second thing that I think I've seen as an opportunity for making getting things to pick up and work is where you position open data as part of the means of implementation for a national initiative. Yeah. So if your country has a development plan that's been branded and the country is pushing forward on it, and the ability to make decisions on delivery of that initiative are tied to better evidence, and open data can be located within that argument, it's likely that you will get the kind of support you need from senior government officials and politicians to get the kind of data that is needed. Remember, we're talking about data with a purpose and this iteration, this new phase of open data. And I think that's where you find the most interest and the ability to lock in to this kind of sale. So I think that's one of the things the couple of things that I'd suggest as possible use cases.
May I just a brief thing that with all the things that they were mentioning, I think peer pressure could help a lot in many cases. I mean, I'm thinking about the places or the countries that are just starting, not the ones that are, really advanced on the agenda, but the other ones, probably in many cases, these global measurement exercises, even though, I discourage the comparison between countries. I'm not using, not trying to rank countries. In some cases, it could provide an incentive for some countries to try to get to certain level or to be similar to the country that is near you, that your neighbor, and so on. So in a way, those kind of exercise could also help in some cases countries that are starting with this agenda.
Yeah,
totally. So it would be kind of data as a means, as Muchiri said, not the end, but also some healthy competition always can come in handy. And then we will move to another question because we are only 7 minutes away. We were asked about thoughts about the use of open data and data measurements connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. Any comments on that? Once again, I have something to kickstart.
I can take a stab at that. Very short. The answer, yes. We should be. That could be another driver. And Natalia, Nati was speaking about the sort of purpose. About the different sort of sectors or just purpose and impact. And the SDGs can be one. Now, I also want to raise the fact that within the sort of development community, there's been the same kind of fragmentation that we've seen inside governments around the data agenda. So you have already a data development partnership for SDGs or something like that. The acronym I'd never say it right.
Me neither.
You have the guys behind the Data Fest that's happening in Montevideo this year. You have, again, the data for development, open or not open. You have, there are also several, like you have the Paris 21 people. You have the Open Data Watch. You had the W3C. There are also different sort of aspects or angles from which you can come to this conversation. And that doesn't mean we cannot coordinate and talk to each other about it. So strictly answering the question, yes, that could be another sort of reason or driver or train of thought for opening data. But I also like to highlight that the fact that we're also not coordinating among ourselves, among donors. So.
Muchiri?
Thank you, Natalie. I think so. I've always felt that these frameworks are excellent catalysts for getting data out the door and beginning that conversation around, especially because for some of us, we're trying to inject policy pronouncements around opening up data into the public and in the public space. So they do have a huge value. My worry with them, though, and here I'm talking about every single one of those frameworks, from the SDGs to the ones on education to disaster risk reduction, pick any of them. They are driven for reporting purposes. Yeah, so the biggest consumers of the data that comes from those for that reporting purpose tend to be external actors. Within countries, people need a whole lot more granular data that's a whole lot more hyper-local in order to make decisions. And I think for me, yes, starting off with thinking about open data for the SDGs or data measurements that support SDG achievement, I think it was a good place to start. But where we need to be now and where we need to be moving much faster towards is the data that allows subnational governments to make decisions around resource allocation, about programming, around interventions, really, related to the SDGs, right? And making that data open. I think that the data that is used for decision making is bound to be much better and less creative than the data we find being put in terms of data for reporting. And we see this concern in Africa with some, especially in the agriculture space, where there's skepticism around the data that we use for reporting on progress on agriculture. With some countries casting aspersions on whether the data provided by other countries is accurate or not. So it can be gamed, and that's why I think data for decision making really should be where we should be paying attention most. Thanks.
Thank you.
Something that reminds me what Muchiri just said, that in many cases when we were looking, because the idea was, at least for the barometer, is to try to understand how it is, what's the status of data for public good. And as I mentioned before, to define public good, among differences, we were looking at SDG. But when we were looking at data, for example, I remember the case of climate. We were specifically saying to the researchers not to go into the international organizations, multilateral organizations, to look for the report, but to try to find the information in the national websites. And in many cases, there was a lot of problems with those indicators, because the data in many cases, it was available in the international reports, but it was not available disaggregated or in some cases in any format in national report for citizens consumption. So in a way, that goes hand in hand with what Muchiri was saying about using certain data for reporting and not for like the national demand in each of the countries. So yes, that's something that was coming to my mind when listening to Muchiri.
I just add in kind of the last minute of this, but there was the UN stats. So the Office of Statistics data of the UN is the one that leads kind of the reporting and the indicators that governments need to provide the information for within the UN system. And open data wasn't part of their core conversations, but they've just had their annual meeting, and now open data is part of their core conversations. So we'll see how that change actually is being implemented, but hopefully that will kind of steer the conversation into not just reporting, but also opening up the data that is being created and gathered for those reports. So that's a really good step forward. There's of course a lot of work to do still, but it's a good idea. I think we do have one more question, but we are on time right now. I'm super sorry that we didn't get to go through all the questions, but it was great to have this discussion and this panel. We want to thank MOSFest for allowing us to have this session. I want to specifically thank Arturo, Muchiri, and Silvana for joining the session. All the links are in the chat. And if anybody wants to connect with us, we're all out there answering emails and DMs in Twitter. Just please reach out to us, and thank you very much, and hope to see you in other sessions in MOSFest. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.